December 7, 1941 began as an ordinary Sunday morning in Hawaii, with servicemen sleeping off Saturday night revelries and officers preparing for leisurely brunches with their families. At 7:55 in the morning, the tranquil Pacific paradise erupted into chaos as the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft screamed down from the clouds above Pearl Harbor. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the attack from his Nakajima bomber, surveyed the American battleships lined up like sleeping giants along Battleship Row and transmitted the fateful code words, "Tora! Tora! Tora!" The architects of this audacious strike believed they had crafted the perfect strategy to cripple American naval power in a single devastating blow. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor operation, had studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington during the 1920s. He understood American industrial capacity better than most of his colleagues in Tokyo, yet even he was pressured by the militarist faction that dominated Japanese leadership. According to historical accounts documented in Gordon Prange's comprehensive work, At Dawn We Slept, Yamamoto himself harbored deep reservations about attacking the United States, reportedly warning his superiors that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year. But beyond that, he had utterly no confidence in victory. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters had calculated their move with mathematical precision. Their intelligence indicated that destroying the American Pacific Fleet would buy them 18 to 24 months to consolidate their conquests across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, and the strategic resources of the Philippines would fall like dominoes into Japanese hands. By the time America rebuilt its shattered fleet, Japan would have constructed an impregnable defensive perimeter stretching from the Aleutian Islands to the Solomon Islands, making any counteroffensive prohibitively costly in American blood and treasure. The civilian population, war-weary and isolationist, would surely force President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to negotiate a settlement recognizing Japan's new empire. The attack itself achieved tactical brilliance beyond Tokyo's expectations. In less than 2 hours, Japanese pilots sank or damaged 8 battleships, destroyed 188 aircraft, and killed 2,403 Americans. The USS Arizona exploded with such violence that her forward magazines detonated, taking 1,177 sailors to the bottom of the harbor in mere moments. The USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds of men inside her steel hull. The USS West Virginia, USS California, and USS Nevada suffered catastrophic damage. Thick black smoke rose thousands of feet into the tropical sky, visible from miles away as oil fires spread across the water's surface. In Tokyo, news of the attack's success prompted celebrations in the streets. The empire of the rising sun had struck the sleeping dragon, and the dragon appeared mortally wounded. Japanese newspapers proclaimed a new era of Asian dominance, free from Western colonial oppression. Military leaders congratulated themselves on their strategic genius, convinced they had bought the precious time needed to solidify their territorial gains. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo addressed the nation, framing the attack as a necessary defensive measure against American economic strangulation through oil embargoes and frozen assets. The war, they assured their citizens, would be short and victorious. December 8, 1941, brought a transformed America to its feet as President Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress at 12:30 in the afternoon. His words, broadcast across the nation via radio, crystallized the national mood in a single phrase that would echo through history. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Within 33 minutes of his 6-minute speech, Congress declared war with only one dissenting vote from Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a committed pacifist who had also voted against entering World War I. The isolationist sentiment that had dominated American politics for 2 decades evaporated overnight like morning dew under a scorching sun. Young men flooded recruitment centers in unprecedented numbers, forming lines that stretched around city blocks in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and countless small towns across the heartland. The day after Pearl Harbor, recruitment offices reported increases of 500% compared to typical daily enlistments. Men lied about their ages, hid medical conditions, and pleaded with officers to accept them into service. According to records maintained by the National Archives, over 1 million men volunteered for military service in the month following Pearl Harbor, transforming America's peacetime military of 1,400,000 into a mobilization machine that would eventually field 16 million service members. What Japanese planners had failed to comprehend was the fundamental difference between attacking Pearl Harbor and actually destroying American naval capability. The three aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet, USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, had been at sea during the attack, conducting training exercises and ferrying aircraft to outlying bases. These floating airfields represented the future of naval warfare, though few admirals on either side fully grasped this reality yet. The battleship-centric thinking that dominated naval strategy had led Yamamoto to prioritize the destruction of obsolete vessels, while the instruments of Japan's eventual defeat steamed safely beyond the harbor entrance. The Roosevelt administration moved with stunning speed to transform American industry into what would become known as the arsenal of democracy. On January 6, 1942, exactly 1 month after Pearl Harbor, the president delivered his State of the Union address outlining production goals that seemed fantastical: 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943, along with 55,000 anti-aircraft guns and thousands of tanks. Industrial leaders thought these targets impossible, yet within months, American factories exceeded them. Henry Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan began producing B-24 Liberator bombers at the rate of 1 aircraft per hour by 1944, a feat of industrial engineering that left Axis planners stunned. The transformation extended far beyond mere production statistics. Women entered the workforce in revolutionary numbers, with Rosie the Riveter becoming the iconic symbol of female contribution to the war effort. African Americans found new opportunities in defense industries, though they still faced discrimination and segregation. The entire economic structure of the nation shifted toward total war mobilization. Automobile manufacturers stopped producing civilian vehicles entirely and retooled their assembly lines for tanks, aircraft, and military vehicles. Rubber, metal, and food rationing became patriotic duties accepted by civilians who understood that their sacrifices directly supported soldiers overseas. Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day, 1941, to assume command of the devastated Pacific Fleet. Walking through the wreckage of Battleship Row, surveying the oil-stained water and the overturned hulks of once mighty warships, Nimitz reportedly told his staff that the Japanese had made 3 critical mistakes. They attacked on a Sunday when most ships were in port, but most crew members were on shore leave, minimizing casualties and personnel who could be reassigned to new vessels. They failed to destroy the fuel storage tanks containing 4.5 million barrels of oil, without which the Pacific Fleet would have been forced to retreat to California. And they missed the repair facilities and dry docks that would prove essential to salvaging damaged ships and maintaining operations. February 19, 1942, marked a turning point in American morale when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle stood before a group of hand-picked volunteer airmen at Eglin Field in Florida and outlined what seemed like a suicide mission. The plan involved launching 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, twin-engine medium bombers that had never taken off from an aircraft carrier, from the deck of USS Hornet to bomb Tokyo and other Japanese cities, before crash landing in China or Russia. When Doolittle asked who would volunteer, knowing they might not return, every man in the room stepped forward. This mission, conceived as both a morale booster for Americans and a psychological blow to Japan, represented the aggressive spirit that was rapidly replacing the shock of Pearl Harbor. The industrial mobilization that Japanese planners had dismissed as theoretically impossible began producing results at breathtaking speed. Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, revolutionized naval construction through prefabrication techniques borrowed from the construction industry. Liberty ships, the merchant vessels that would carry the sinews of war across both oceans, took an average of 230 days to build in 1941. By December 1942, Kaiser had reduced construction time to an average of 42 days, and in November of that year, The yard assembled the SS Robert E. Peary in just 4 days and 15 hours as a publicity demonstration. These vessels poured from American shipyards at a rate that exceeded Axis submarines' ability to sink them, eventually producing 2,710 Liberty ships during the war. Aircraft production transformed from peacetime numbers measured in hundreds to wartime production measured in tens of thousands. The Boeing plant in Seattle expanded from employing 4,000 workers in 1941 to over 30,000 by mid-1942. Multiple shifts worked around the clock as assembly lines stretched across factory floors the size of football fields. The Douglas Aircraft Company alone produced nearly 30,000 aircraft during the war years. Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, Grumman on Long Island, and North American Aviation in California joined this unprecedented industrial symphony. By the end of 1942, American factories produced 47,836 aircraft, approaching Roosevelt's supposedly impossible goal. The American military underwent a transformation equally dramatic as its industrial base. Training camps sprouted across the nation like mushrooms after rain. Fort Benning in Georgia, Camp Pendleton in California, Great Lakes Naval Training Station in Illinois, and hundreds of other facilities processed millions of civilians into soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. The logistics of this transformation staggered the imagination. Uniforms, weapons, equipment, food, housing, and instruction for millions of men required coordination on a scale never before attempted. According to military historians, the United States trained more pilots in 1942 alone than Japan trained during the entire war, creating a bottomless reservoir of aviators to replace combat losses, while Japanese pilot quality steadily declined as experienced flyers died and training programs failed to keep pace. The Navy's Bureau of Ships worked frantically to design and produce new aircraft carriers that would replace and exceed the pre-war fleet. The Essex-class fleet carriers, displacing 27,000 tons and capable of carrying over 90 aircraft, entered production at multiple shipyards simultaneously. The first of these, USS Essex herself, was commissioned on December 31, 1942, exactly 1 year and 24 days after Pearl Harbor. Behind her came a flood of sister ships: USS Yorktown, USS Intrepid, USS Hornet, USS Franklin, USS Bunker Hill, and 14 others by war's end. Complementing these fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls, and over 120 escort carriers provided air support for amphibious operations and convoy protection. This carrier production represented an industrial achievement that Japan, with its limited shipbuilding capacity, could never hope to match. Intelligence operations accelerated in parallel with industrial and military mobilization. Station Hypo in Hawaii, the Navy's Signals Intelligence Unit, worked tirelessly to crack Japanese naval codes. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts, linguists, and traffic analysts labored in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, surviving on coffee and cigarettes as they pieced together fragments of intercepted Japanese communications. Their work, building on pre-war cryptographic breakthroughs, would soon provide Admiral Nimitz with intelligence advantages that partially compensated for Japan's numerical superiority in the Pacific during those first critical months. April 18, 1942, dawned clear over Tokyo as citizens went about their Sunday routines, confident that their home islands remained invulnerable to American retaliation. At noon, air raid sirens wailed across the capital for the first time since the war began, but most people assumed it was merely another drill. Then the bombs began falling. 16 B-25 bombers led by Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle roared over Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya at rooftop level, dropping high explosives and incendiaries on industrial targets, military facilities, and symbolic locations. The material damage proved negligible, but the psychological impact devastated Japanese confidence and vindicated American resolve. The Doolittle Raid, as it became known through contemporary newspaper accounts, including detailed coverage in the New York Times on April 21, 1942, accomplished far more than its planners dared hope. Emperor Hirohito demanded to know how American bombers had reached the sacred home islands. Admiral Yamamoto, personally humiliated that his failure to destroy American carriers had enabled this attack, pressured the Naval General Staff to approve his plan for a decisive battle that would lure the remaining American carriers into a trap and annihilate them. This obsession with forcing a climactic engagement would lead Japanese planning toward Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand in the Central Pacific that would become the graveyard of Japanese naval aviation. May 7th and 8th, 1942 brought the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval engagement in history where opposing ships never sighted each other, with all combat conducted by carrier aircraft. American carrier task forces intercepted a Japanese invasion fleet heading toward Port Moresby in New Guinea, threatening Australia's northern approaches. The tactical result proved ambiguous. Japan sank USS Lexington and damaged USS Yorktown, while losing the light carrier Shoho and suffering heavy damage to the fleet carrier Shokaku. The strategic consequences, however, favored America decisively. The Japanese invasion force turned back, marking the first time since the war began that an Allied force had halted Japanese expansion. More critically, 2 Japanese fleet carriers, Shokaku damaged and Zuikaku missing most of her air group, would miss the upcoming Midway operation. June 4th through 7th, 1942 witnessed the battle that changed the Pacific War's trajectory. Thanks to Commander Rochefort's cryptanalysts breaking enough of the Japanese naval code to predict the attack on Midway, Admiral Nimitz positioned his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of the atoll to ambush the Japanese strike force. The Japanese approached with 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and supporting vessels, confident they would catch the Americans by surprise and destroy their carrier force piecemeal. The battle unfolded with dramatic reversals of fortune that seemed scripted for maximum tension. Initial American torpedo bomber attacks achieved nothing except the deaths of heroic aviators who pressed home their attacks, despite inadequate fighter cover and obsolete malfunctioning torpedoes. 35 of 41 Devastator torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Hornet were shot down without scoring a single hit. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet lost all 15 aircraft with only 1 survivor, Ensign George Gay, who floated in the water throughout the battle, watching the subsequent action while hiding from Japanese ships under his seat cushion. Then, in 5 minutes that decided the Pacific War, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese carriers just as they were most vulnerable, with aircraft being rearmed and refueled on their flight decks after recovering the strike force that had bombed Midway. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led Enterprise's dive bombers down on Akagi and Kaga, while Yorktown's squadron hit Soryu. Within minutes, all 3 Japanese carriers were burning infernos, their wooden flight decks ablaze with aviation fuel and exploding ammunition. Hiryu escaped temporarily and launched strikes that fatally damaged Yorktown, but American dive bombers found her later that afternoon and sent her to join her sisters. By June 7th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers had sunk, taking with them over 3,000 sailors, and more importantly, hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots and aircraft mechanics. The aftermath of Midway exposed the fundamental miscalculations that had driven Japanese strategy since Pearl Harbor. In exactly 6 months, from December 7th, 1941 to June 7th, 1942, the strategic balance in the Pacific had reversed completely. Japan began the war with 10 aircraft carriers to America's 3 in the Pacific. After Midway, this ratio inverted, with Japan reduced to supporting carriers while American shipyards prepared to launch a tidal wave of new fleet carriers. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost not just 4 irreplaceable ships, but the institutional knowledge embodied in their highly trained crews. Japanese naval aviation would never recover from this blow. The naval aviators who died at Midway represented years of intensive pre-war training that Japan's accelerated wartime programs could not replicate. Before the war, Japanese carrier pilots underwent rigorous selection and training lasting several years, creating an elite corps of naval aviators whose skill exceeded that of most Western pilots. However, this system proved catastrophically brittle. When these veterans died, Japan lacked the fuel, training aircraft, instructors, and time to replace them with equally skilled pilots. American training programs, by contrast, produced adequate pilots in large numbers, accepting higher initial loss rates, but building a sustainable system that improved over time as combat veterans returned to teach at training schools. Admiral Yamamoto recognized the disaster's implications immediately. He attempted to conceal the extent of the defeat from even the Japanese government, hospitalizing surviving officers and crew in isolated facilities where they could not communicate the truth. The official announcement claimed a great victory at Midway, reporting the sinking of 2 American carriers while admitting the loss of only 1 Japanese carrier. This deception prevented realistic strategic reassessment by Japanese leadership. Staff officers who understood the true situation feared to contradict the official narrative in Japan's rigid military hierarchy, where junior officers challenging senior decisions could face severe punishment. The culture of face-saving and institutional inflexibility that characterized Japanese military leadership prevented the kind of honest analysis that might have led to a negotiated peace, while Japan still held strong territorial positions. The economic disparities that Yamamoto had feared became starkly apparent as 1942 progressed. American industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, dwarfed Japanese production in every category. In 1942 alone, the United States produced 60,000 aircraft to Japan's 8,600. American shipyards launched 1 million tons of naval vessels compared to Japan's 260,000 tons. Steel production told an even more dramatic story. America produced 75 million tons while Japan managed 7 million tons, a disparity of more than 10 to 1. These numbers translated directly into military capability, as the Pacific War evolved into an industrial attrition contest that Japan could not possibly win. The strategic initiative shifted irrevocably to American hands following Midway. On August 7, 1942, less than 2 months after the battle, the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, beginning America's first major offensive operation of the Pacific War. Japanese forces, still reeling from Midway and stretched thin across their vast conquered territories, found themselves fighting desperately to hold positions they had assumed were safely in their rear areas. The landing at Guadalcanal demonstrated that America's Germany First strategy, which prioritized the European theater, still allowed for aggressive action in the Pacific that kept Japan off balance and unable to consolidate their defensive perimeter. The Guadalcanal campaign evolved into a 6-month attritional nightmare that consumed Japanese naval and air strength at unsustainable rates. The waters around the island became known as Iron Bottom Sound, due to the numerous warships sunk by both sides in a series of brutal night surface engagements. Japanese forces, demonstrating the fierce determination that would characterize their defense of every subsequent position, contested every ridge and valley with fanatical intensity. However, American logistics and industrial power proved decisive. The U.S. could replace losses in ships, aircraft, and men. Japan could not. By February 1943, starving Japanese troops evacuated Guadalcanal, leaving behind 10,000 dead and abandoning their first conquered territory since the war began. January 1943 marked the 1-year anniversary of the Arcadia Conference in Washington, where Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had established the Allied Grand Strategy. Reviewing the Pacific situation, American planners marveled at the transformation wrought in 12 months. The desperate defensive mindset of early 1942 had given way to confident planning for offensive operations across the Pacific on multiple axes. Admiral Nimitz in Hawaii coordinated a Central Pacific drive through the Gilbert, Marshall, Caroline, and Mariana Island chains toward the Philippines and Japan itself, while General Douglas MacArthur in Australia directed a Southwest Pacific advance through New Guinea toward the same objectives. The shipbuilding achievements that Japanese planners had deemed impossible became reality throughout 1943. Essex-class fleet carriers joined the Pacific Fleet at a rate of approximately 1 every other month. USS Essex herself arrived in May, followed by USS Yorktown in September, USS Lexington in October, and USS Bunker Hill in December. Each carrier represented over 30,000 tons of steel, millions of man-hours of labor, and decades of accumulated naval engineering expertise, yet American shipyards produced them with assembly line efficiency. Accompanying these fleet carriers came dozens of escort carriers, over 100 destroyers, and support vessels numbering in the thousands. The Imperial Japanese Navy, struggling to replace its Midway losses, launched only one new fleet carrier, Taiho, during the entire year. Aircraft production differentials grew even more lopsided as American industry hit full stride. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter, specifically designed to counter the vaunted Zero, entered service in mid-1943 and immediately established aerial supremacy wherever it appeared. Hellcats, produced at a rate exceeding 1,000 per month by late 1943, combined armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, powerful radial engines, and heavy armament that Zero pilots could not match. The Vought F-4U Corsair, with its distinctive inverted gull wings and even greater performance, supplemented Hellcats in Marine Corps and Navy squadrons. Japan, meanwhile, continued producing Zeros with only modest improvements, unable to develop and mass-produce advanced fighters due to industrial limitations and design conservatism. The submarine campaign that Japan had largely neglected while focusing on battleship-centric surface warfare proved devastatingly effective in American hands. U.S. Navy submarines, initially hampered by defective Mark 14 torpedoes that either ran too deep or failed to detonate, began achieving remarkable success once these problems were corrected in mid-1943. American submarines targeted Japanese merchant shipping with ruthless efficiency, sinking tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan, and freighters transporting raw materials essential for war production. By year's end, American submarines had sent over 1,800,000 tons of Japanese shipping to the bottom, strangling the island nation's economy and severing the supply lines to its far-flung garrisons. The November 1943 assault on Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands provided a costly but instructive lesson in amphibious warfare against fortified positions. Marines storming ashore encountered withering fire from Japanese defenders who had transformed the tiny atoll into a fortress of concrete bunkers, pillboxes, and interconnected defensive positions. Over 1,000 Marines died in 76 hours of fighting that shocked the American public with its intensity. However, the lessons learned at Tarawa about naval gunfire support, amphibious tactics, reef reconnaissance, and combined arms coordination would save thousands of lives in subsequent operations. More importantly, Tarawa's capture provided air bases that brought Japan's Marshall Islands within range of American bombers, enabling the next phase of the Central Pacific Offensive. December 1943 brought reflection on 2 years of war and anticipation of coming offensives. American military strength in the Pacific had grown exponentially from the dark days following Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet now numbered over 700 vessels, including 6 fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, dozens of escort carriers, 12 battleships, including 6 salvaged and modernized from Pearl Harbor, and hundreds of destroyers, submarines, and support ships. American ground forces in the Pacific exceeded 300,000 combat troops, with millions more training stateside. Japanese forces, by contrast, remained scattered across an immense area stretching from Burma to the Central Pacific, unable to concentrate effectively against American thrusts and increasingly isolated by submarine warfare and American air superiority. January through June 1944 witnessed the acceleration of American offensive operations to a pace that left Japanese defenders reeling. Operation Flintlock in the Marshalls demonstrated how thoroughly American forces had mastered amphibious warfare in the 18 months since Guadalcanal. Kwajalein, the world's largest coral atoll, fell in just 4 days with casualties far lighter than Tarawa, thanks to improved tactics, overwhelming naval gunfire support, and complete air superiority. The rapid conquest of the Marshalls, bypassing heavily fortified Vocha, Maloelap, Mili, and Jaluit atolls to wither on the vine, demonstrated Admiral Nimitz's embrace of the island-hopping strategy that avoided Japanese strongpoints while seizing positions that dominated entire regions. The industrial production that had seemed impossible in January 1942 reached truly staggering levels by mid-1944. American factories produced 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone, compared to 28,000 for Japan. This nearly 4-to-1 advantage in production occurred despite Japan's victory disease propaganda claiming imminent triumph. Every month, hundreds of new American pilots completed training and joined combat squadrons, while Japanese training programs, starved of fuel and experienced instructors, produced increasingly inadequate replacements for mounting losses. The qualitative gap in pilot skill, already evident by late 1943, widened into a chasm that Japanese courage and determination could not bridge. June 19th and 20th, 1944 brought the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which American pilots nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, due to the one-sided nature of aerial combat. Japanese naval aviation, rebuilt after Midway with inferior pilots and attempting one final decisive battle, launched over 400 aircraft against American carriers covering the invasion of Saipan. American fighter directors, using radar and excellent radio discipline, vectored Hellcat fighters into perfect intercepts that slaughtered Japanese attackers before they could reach the carriers. The Japanese lost over 300 aircraft in one day, while shooting down only 30 American planes. Additionally, American submarines sank 2 fleet carriers, Taiho and Shokaku, further decimating Japanese naval strength. The fall of Saipan in July 1944 brought the strategic bombing campaign against Japan within reach. From Saipan's airfields, Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach Tokyo, Osaka, and other industrial centers in the Japanese home islands. The Superfortress, a technological marvel featuring pressurized crew compartments, remote, controlled gun turrets, and capacity to carry 8 tons of bombs over thousands of miles, represented America's industrial and technological superiority in tangible form. Each B-29 required over 55,000 engineering man-hours to produce, cost $640,000, equivalent to over $10 million today, and embodied cutting-edge technology that Japan could not hope to replicate. By war's end, Boeing and other contractors produced nearly 4,000 of these strategic bombers. The loss of Saipan precipitated a political crisis in Tokyo that ended General Tojo's government. Japanese civilians and military leaders finally began to grasp the hopelessness of their strategic position, though institutional inertia and fear of American occupation prevented serious peace overtures. Tojo's replacement, General Kuniaki Koiso, inherited an impossible situation. The home islands under increasing air attack, the combined fleet shattered, merchant shipping devastated by submarines, and American forces advancing inexorably across the Pacific. Yet Japanese military culture, which considered surrender the ultimate dishonor, prevented rational acceptance of defeat. Instead, leaders embraced increasingly desperate measures, eventually culminating in kamikaze tactics that squandered the lives of pilots and aircraft in one-way suicide attacks. October 1944 brought the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, as Japanese forces attempted one final gamble to disrupt MacArthur's return to the Philippines. The Japanese plan, characteristically complex and dependent on precise timing, called for multiple forces to converge on the American landing beaches and destroy the vulnerable transports and amphibious ships. The resulting battle, actually a series of separate engagements spread across thousands of square miles, demonstrated the complete technological and numerical superiority American forces now enjoyed. Japanese ships, many operating without air cover due to the devastation of carrier aviation at Philippine Sea, faced American warships equipped with superior radar, fire control systems, and overwhelming numbers. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered Leyte Gulf as a functional fighting force. It departed as a shattered remnant incapable of affecting future operations. The 6 months from December 7, 1941 to June 7, 1942 encompassed one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in military history. Japan's leaders had gambled that a devastating surprise attack would shock America into accepting Japanese hegemony over East Asia and the Western Pacific. They calculated that destroying the American battle fleet would buy 18 to 24 months to consolidate conquests and build an impregnable defensive perimeter. They believed American industrial capacity, while theoretically impressive, could not be mobilized quickly enough to prevent this consolidation. They assumed that American public opinion, isolationist and casualty-averse, would force a negotiated peace rather than accept the bloodshed required to reclaim lost territories. Every assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The Pearl Harbor attack, rather than breaking American will, unified the nation with an intensity that surprised even Roosevelt. The industrial mobilization that Japanese planners considered impossible began within days of the attack and reached full stride within months. The carrier force that survived Pearl Harbor, rather than retreating to safety, aggressively raided Japanese positions despite numerical inferiority. The American public, far from demanding peace, accepted rationing, sent millions of men to military service, and displayed determination that only hardened as the war continued. Most fundamentally, Japanese strategy rested on the premise that destroying battleships equaled destroying naval power, a pre-war assumption that carriers, submarines, and amphibious warfare rendered obsolete. The industrial differential that doomed Japan became evident remarkably quickly. By June 1942, American shipyards had already launched more tonnage than Japan would produce during the entire year. American aircraft factories produced more planes in the first 6 months of war than Japan managed annually. The population differential, 130 million Americans versus 75 million Japanese, translated into vastly larger military forces once mobilization completed. The resource differential proved even more decisive. America produced its own oil, steel, and raw materials, while Japan depended on shipping these resources thousands of miles from conquered territories, shipping increasingly vulnerable to submarine attack. The cryptographic advantage that Commander Rochefort's team provided at Midway exemplified technological and institutional differences between the combatants. American codebreakers worked in an environment encouraging initiative, where junior officers could challenge assumptions and pursue unconventional approaches. Japanese military culture, rigidly hierarchical and resistant to bad news, never achieved comparable signals intelligence success. American radar technology, while initially crude, improved rapidly throughout the war and provided increasingly decisive advantages in night combat and aircraft interception. Japanese radar development lagged significantly, leaving their ships and aircraft vulnerable to attacks they could not detect until too late. The strategic flexibility demonstrated by American planners stood in stark contrast to Japanese rigidity. After Midway, American strategy evolved to exploit Japanese weaknesses through island hopping, submarine warfare, and strategic bombing. Japanese strategy, by contrast, remained fixated on decisive battle concepts even after Midway proved such battles suicidal against American industrial and technological superiority. The willingness of American commanders to bypass strong points and let them wither, as at Rabaul and the Marshall Atolls, demonstrated strategic sophistication that Japanese commanders, committed to defending every position regardless of strategic value, could not match. The human cost of Japan's miscalculation ultimately exceeded 2.5 million Japanese military deaths and over 1 million civilian casualties by war's end. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9, while ending the war and arguably saving millions of lives that would have been lost in an invasion, resulted directly from the strategic situation Japan's leaders created by attacking Pearl Harbor. American deaths, while terrible at over 400,000 military personnel, remained far lower than they would have been had Japan achieved its objective of making reconquest so costly that America accepted a negotiated peace. The Pearl Harbor attack that Japanese leaders believed would end the war in months instead awakened an industrial and military giant whose response shocked them completely. The 6 months from Pearl Harbor to Midway transformed America from a nation reeling from surprise attack into an advancing juggernaut whose industrial capacity, technological innovation, and strategic flexibility Japan could not hope to counter. Admiral Yamamoto's prophetic words about running wild for 6 months proved grimly accurate. Exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, at Midway, the tide turned permanently against Japan. The remaining 3 years of war merely confirmed what those first 6 months revealed. Japan had made a catastrophic miscalculation in attacking an opponent whose industrial might, once aroused, proved utterly overwhelming. The lesson echoed across subsequent decades. Industrial capacity, technological innovation, and societal mobilization matter as much in modern warfare as tactical brilliance or martial courage, and nations that miscalculate these factors risk not merely defeat, but annihilation.